friends and neighbors who called him not Mr. President, but Mr. Jimmy, will lead the nation in paying their respects. Mr. Carter's remains will be carried by hearse from Phoebe Sumter Medical Center in nearby Americus, Georgia. His former Secret Service agents will serve as pallbearers. The hearse will then be armed. Today is the first day of funeral services honoring Carter. This will be the first time we will see Carter's family and his casket. After this morning's event in the Plains area, the motorcade then heads to Atlanta. On Tuesday, Carter departs the Carter one last time to travel to Washington, D.C., where he will lie in state at the U.S. Capitol. Then Thursday, a funeral will be held at Washington National Cathedral, followed by a private funeral in Plains.
In 2018, CBS Evening News managing editor and anchor Norah O'Donnell sat down with former President Jimmy Carter, and they discussed what he thought about how he hoped to be remembered. Take a listen. How do you want to be remembered?
Well, with my family, I hope I could be remembered by as a good great-grandfather, a good grandfather, and a good father. But a lot of everybody remembers as a good husband. In politics, every chance of peace and human rights. I was lucky enough to keep our country at peace for the 4 years that I served, and we were, I think, looked upon as a champion of human rights then. So that's the two things I just politically speaking of. I'm proud of.
As you can see, agents representing the United States Secret Service, part of President Carter's post-presidency detail there at the hearse, paying their respects and placing it inside. Only on CBS News this morning, we are joined by Douglas Brinkley, presidential historian and author of The Unfinished Presidency, Jimmy Carter's Legacy Beyond the White House. Doug, your thoughts this morning as we begin this 6-day national process of honoring, remembering, and heralding the 39th president?
Well, it's so fitting that we're beginning in Plains, Georgia. This little hamlet, as he used to call it, meant everything to him. And it really represents Carter's whole way of looking at the world. First off, Christ in his heart. And the part of the scripture that he cared the most about was the Good Samaritan, being a good neighbor, pull together if somebody's in need, get to know the names of the people, not just in Plains, but Americus and other nearby towns. Next, he loved his ancestry. When he was in the White House, the Latter-day Saints sent him his detailed ancestry. And no sooner did he get out of the White House than he started pulling it all together. And then he invited hundreds of Gordon's and his mother's side and Carter's all to meet and talk about their genealogy. And he went all over Georgia looking at the gravestones of former ancestors, and it spurred him to even writing a book about the American Revolution in Georgia, because he thought everybody thought the Revolutionary War only was fought and conquered or Lexington or up north, but Georgia played quite a cost in the Revolutionary War.
And such an intellect, having written over 30 books, so really interested in history and knowing where he came from. I want to turn now to Chief Election and Campaign Correspondent Robert Costa. Robert, you spent some time in Plains, Georgia, where President Carter spent most of his life.
Good to be with you, and we're watching the late president's casket right there on screen, a moving moment for the country, and fascinating to hear from our friend, the historian Douglas Brinkley, who's there with you. Doug Brinkley, as he and I have often discussed over the years, he went down to Plains, Georgia countless times to speak with former President Carter, as did many reporters, to go see him teach Sunday school at Maranatha Baptist, to see him in that small town. But what's so interesting about Jimmy Carter is that while he returned to Plains, Georgia after the presidency, returned to his hometown, and that town, that small town in southern Georgia, embodied his spirit, he was also a man of the world throughout his presidency, his pre-presidency, a naval officer, and his post-presidency. He had Plains as his base, Plains as his soul, politically and in other ways. But he was always engaged in human rights, in seeking peace, in traveling and going to Atlanta, to going to Asia and Europe to solve issues like the Guinea War. And so you see in the legacy of Jimmy Carter, this spirit of Plains, which is plain-spoken, southern, unpretentious, but also this ambition to work his will on some of the core issues of our time.
Nicole Killian is also with us, and just to update you on what you're seeing, the hearse is waiting because the Carter family, in many numbers, is assembling in adjacent vehicles, and when they are all assembled, then the process will begin. Nicole Killian, your thoughts, please.
Well, as we watch the hearse in front of Phoebe Sumter Medical Center, it's important to note that this is in Americus, Georgia, which is just a couple of miles outside of Plains. And while certainly Plains was the home of Jimmy Carter, it really is that whole region there in southern Georgia that embraces him. He is their native son, and certainly this medical center tended to him many times, kind of in his final years, up until the time that he entered hospice care, where he then spent his final years there in Plains. So this is a very important location, certainly to the former president, to his family, and will be the beginning of his journey as this hearse makes its way through Plains, ultimately up to Atlanta. The state of Georgia as a whole, again, this is its native son. President Jimmy Carter is the only president to represent the state of Georgia. So this is a very painful goodbye for those locally, those in the state, but also nationally as well. And while certainly President Carter has a mixed record, I think for the most part, we have heard in the outpouring of tributes over the past several days that people remember him as this humanitarian, as someone who was Christ-centered, and as someone who really cared about people. And I think we will continue to see that in the outpouring of tributes as this memorial procession makes its way through the state, and ultimately as the president makes his way here to the nation's capital in the coming days.
Yeah, Nicole, it's important too to note the former Secret Service agents are the ones that have their hand on that car. You can only imagine what they must be thinking and feeling, knowing that this moment would come. But they spent so many years and really got to know the former president there. Senior national correspondent Mark Strassman is in Plains, and I know he spoke to the family pastor this morning. Mark, what more can you tell us?
Hey, Jerika, this is Church Street, downtown Plains. The people you see over my left shoulder, most of them are Jimmy Carter's friends and neighbors. They're the ones who would see him walking or riding his bike through town, and they're the ones who, as the major said, would call him Mr. Jimmy, not Mr. President. One of them is Tony Loudon, the former pastor at Maranatha Baptist Church, who was Jimmy Carter's pastor for 5 years. I talked to him last night, and he was essentially telling me what a body blow losing Jimmy Carter is to him personally, but in a larger spiritual sense, what he said is the Sunday school teacher was called home on a Sunday. Mm-hmm. And he said whenever he and Jimmy Carter got together, Carter would ask him 3 questions. Where have you been? Who have you helped? And how can I help you? That was just part of his commitment to service that lasted a lifetime. To understand Carter's improbable rise to the White House, you have to understand how small Plains really is. Even today, 540 people, 2 family-owned restaurants, no stoplights. Carter lived about a half mile from where I'm standing. And the everyday rhythms of Plains life, he always found appealing. And it's one of the things I talked to his grandson, Jason, about just a couple of months ago.
I think for a long time in my grandfather's life, he was only looking at what was left undone, right? He's one of those people who was always trying to finish, whether it was eradicating guinea worm disease or, building peace and democracy in South Sudan. Whatever project he was on, he was digging into. But I do think over the last several years, he's been able to reflect on the achievements, and both in terms of peace, but also in terms of, for example, preservation of land, the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, those massive legacy impacts. I think he has been able to appreciate them.
So this 6-day national farewell begins here in Plains, and on next Thursday it will end here in Plains. There will also be a funeral service at Maranatha Baptist Church, and then Mr. Carter will be buried about a half mile from where I'm standing on the family property next to Rosalind Carter, his wife of 77 years.
Yeah, and as we watch the procession right now, Mark, you can just see people outside with their American flags. We just saw the Secret Service with their right hand over their heart as the hearse was making its way down the street here. Just a touching moment, if we can just take a listen and observe some of these pictures here. When President Carter, as you mentioned, Mark, is buried at his home in Plains, he will be reunited with his wife, Rosalind. She was a friend and neighbor of the Carter family as a child. After their first date, Jimmy Carter told his mother, "She's the girl I want to marry." That marriage lasted 77 years. Got a lot of people that don't even live to be that old. The two were the longest married presidential couple in the United States history. Rosalind passed away in November of 2023 at the age of 96. And, you know, when I think about what he represents, again, for people who are just sort of being introduced to him, to hear about him as a man and as a family man, but also, again, what he did after his life. But that says something, you know, 77 years, there's no getting around that. That's a big deal.
And the town of Americus is where they shared a lot of joys, because in Americus is where Habitat for Humanity was headquartered. It was Reverend Millard Fuller, very eccentric kind of character, who created up the idea of Habitat. And instead of the big public housing in urban areas that were being built in Chicago and New York and elsewhere in the 70s, Habitat did smaller homes. So they would regularly be in Americus for the Habitat offices and board meetings. Secondarily, Rosalind Carter, her long shadow at the Carter Center in Atlanta, and Jimmy Carter, hers is there in Americas at Georgia Southwestern, where her Institute for Mental Health is there. And when she took on the issue of mental health, it was stigmatized, and she did more than anybody to talk about that, shed light that you should not be embarrassed about it. And you see throughout their lives, both Jimmy and Rosalind Carter finding a lot of healthy, good times trying to help people that had mental illness and people that were in jail and that they thought should not be incarcerated.
And picking up on that point, I want to go back to Robert Costa, who is with us in Washington. Robert, it was enormously important for all of Jimmy Carter's political career to have Rosalind at his side, and was visible in the White House, and was not only a fierce internal advocate for him, but an external one as well.
And Mrs. Carter did not love the idea of coming back, at least initially, to Plains.
Not at all.
She really enjoyed that life of being a spouse in the United States Navy, traveling the world and traveling the country with then Officer Jimmy Carter. But after Carter's father passed away, he wanted to return to the family's peanut warehouse and the peanut business, the shelling business down in Plains. And she came with him. And when you talk to Carter allies, like I spent a lot of time this week with 90-year-old Jerry Rafshoon, who was one of Carter's key political advisors, that she was there at his side in 1966 when he ran and lost a race for governor against a segregationist. But he came back, encouraged by Mrs. Carter, encouraged by others to seek the governorship in 1970, and he won that race. And he famously declared in January of 1971 in his inaugural address, "The time for racial discrimination in Georgia is over." And this set off so much attention on Carter across the country. Reporters started traveling down to Plains and to Atlanta to meet this new governor who was different, represented perhaps a new South, moving away from the segregationist past. And a lot of that comes back to Plains. Carter's own mother, Miss Lillian. She was someone who had a different view on race than a lot of people in the South at a time of racism and segregation. Carter grew up with black people as part of his family community in a way that a lot of people in the South did not at the time.
Yeah, and Rosalind, as you see pictures of the two of them, clearly supported her husband in that way and gave so much of herself as someone who was attached to a president, a governor, a state senator. I want to turn back to Mark Strassman, because I know he's got an interesting story to talk about in reference to the rocking chair and Miss Rosalind Carter. Tell us about that, Mark.
Yeah, if you go to Jimmy Carter's office at the Carter Presidential Center, there's a handmade wooden two-seat rocking chair. And this is where Mrs. Carter would sit during meetings that she was part of. And Jason Carter, the Carter's grandson, also told me he could not count the number of times that he walked into that office to find Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, his grandparents, sitting in that rocking chair side by side, just chatting. And as another illustration of just how, even when they weren't together, they were never far out of mind. In Jimmy Carter's office, if you sat in the chair and look straight across the office, there's a portrait of Rosalind Carter on the far wall. If you go into Rosalynn Carter's office and sit in her chair, there's a portrait of Jimmy Carter on the far wall. So 77 years, constant companions, surely mutually inspiring to each other. And as Jason Carter said, one of the things that he celebrates most about his grandparents is that they had a true love story.
And as we behold the images this morning, as this begins the 6-day national process of saying farewell to our 39th president, it's worth pointing out that these procedures have an intentionality to them. They are studied, they're prepared, presidents are involved in this. The planning for this began, you might not believe this, but it's true, in 1986. And it began with the Secret Service detail for former President Carter. That's the first images we saw. There's a reason for that. The bond there is important, and CBS News reporter Nicole Scango recently spoke with a few of those Secret Service agents who've been with Carter for the years, traveled the world with them. Nicole, catch us up.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Major. The world knew him as President Carter. His neighbors knew him as Mr. Jimmy, and his Secret Service protective detail codenamed him Deacon for his deep conviction, his deep faith, and of course they knew wherever they were traveling around the world. And we spoke with agents who had visited more than 140 countries with former President Carter. They always knew they would be returning to Plains, Georgia come Sunday so he could give that Sunday school lesson at church. I want to share with our viewers a conversation we had with 4 former special agents in charge. We've seen all of them today act as pallbearers carrying the casket to the hearse. Special agents in charge, Don Witham, Nick Steen, Bill Bush, and Alex Parker. Together, they have 46 collective years of protective service to the former president. Take a listen at our conversation.
He wanted to come back home, and when he started his life here, and he wanted to end it here.
And I think it speaks volumes of their marriage, because the one thing for sure is he wanted to be there. And they picked their spot, and a spot that they enjoyed walking together.
And they picked it too.
That's correct.
They picked it. I was there when they did it too. They picked it.
Yeah.
What was that conversation like?
To me, it was almost like, okay, you're planning for your death and you know where you want to be buried. To me, I thought that was very, very telling as to what kind of person that he is.
He had vision in
Yes.
life and in death.
Yes, yes.
Vision in life and in death, and you saw Alex Parker there. This photo I want to share with our viewers. In 2002, when Carter won the Nobel Peace Prize, he called on Alex Parker. He had the Secret Service protective detail at the time assembled, all of the members, so they could take a picture with the Nobel Peace Prize. He told his agents as they gathered that night that they were as much a part of this as he was. A really special bond between the two of them. And as you know, there are a lot of superlatives that are associated with former President Carter, longest living president. It also marks his post-presidency, the longest ever Secret Service protective mission. And that mission really evolved in his later years, with agents looking after, not only his security, but his health, his well-being. I spoke with Special Agent in Charge Don Witham, who told us that as recently as this past 4th of July, the former president was actually still traveling about Plains, celebrating. In fact, he had told his agents that he wanted to see the 4th of July fireworks display. And so this is where the secret and Secret Service comes in. Agents discreetly brought him to nearby Americus so that he could partake in, under the cover of darkness without anyone else knowing, one last fireworks display. He watched it for over 30 minutes before returning to his home in Plains, Georgia. One last celebration for the Navy sailor turned American president, guys.
Yeah, and it says so much just about the type of man that he was to want to take that picture, like you said, with Secret Service. I heard a story where Andrew Young, Ambassador Young from Atlanta, was running for office, and he said he was in a restaurant and he noticed that Mr. Carter went and shook the hands of the people in the kitchen staff, and he realized it wasn't enough to just talk to the people that were out there, and he took that observation and he did the same. So it's remembering everyone that it takes to keep him safe, but also especially as a president that makes this country go round and round, making everyone feel special. President Carter's contribution to global public health is also being listed as one of his top accomplishments. He spoke to CBS News chief medical correspondent Dr. John Mapook back in 2007.
I would say that the greatest challenge that the world faces today is a growing, increasing chasm between rich people and poor people. And the more difference there is between us, the less attention we pay to them, the less communication we have with them, the less inclined we are to understand their problem or to recognize even that they exist, much less to help them overcome their plight.
And Dr. John Mapook joins us now. When you hear that, that was 2007. How does that hit today in 2025?
Of course, the wealth disparity, the difference between the rich and the poor has gotten a lot worse. And it's a perfect example of how much he cared about the little guy and about health equity. And people have been talking about guinea worm. It's just a perfect example of how he was able to have all of his power. And instead of just using it for one self-aggrandizing way, he brought together public, government, private, drug companies to do what he wanted to do. And it was like there were 3.5 million cases of guinea worm, which is a devastating disease, in 1986. And he brought together all sorts of partnerships to try to eliminate that. And an example of how he used his political power is, of course, there was a big civil war going on in Sudan. And he brokered a 6-month ceasefire in 1995 that allowed people to get in there and do the sanitation cleanup that was needed. And actually, at the same time, they also said, we're going to give you some shots and some polio vaccinations. When I spoke at the very beginning, it was 3.5 million. And at the last count, there are 11 cases of guinea worm. And this is just an example. I mean, he did the same thing with river blindness, where which is another devastating disease. It's spread by a black fly, and there was just a devastating problem. And he partnered with Merck. Actually, Merck developed a drug that was able to take care of it. And the problem was getting it the last mile to people in the villages. And so Merck said, okay, we're going to give it. We're going to donate it for free forever. And which they have done, but they needed the Carter people in the organization and getting the community leaders to be able to get it down to actually to the people.
And the picture you're seeing there is President Carter's boyhood home in Archery, Georgia. Dr. LeBook, I want to talk about something that is coincidental to the Carter presidency, but certainly very important as we think about aging Americans now. Jimmy Carter spent much of his last part of his life in hospice care, a very long period of time. Hospice care was not widely known during his presidency, but the first national conventions around that were convened during the Carter presidency, and his administration recognized hospice as something the federal government might have to reimburse in the future. Some of the things that we now take for granted, those of us who've been through the process with aging parents, started during the Carter presidency.
Yeah, and the fact that he went into hospice was very public about it. It was so important. I did a piece on it, and one of the most interesting things is there was a huge amount of stigma for people going into hospice. They said, I'm going into hospice, and the woman who I was interviewing in her 90s, she said, at first I thought, I guess that means that's it for me, because you're supposed to have 6 months to live. Well, of course, he went, a year and a half. So it's not so much that you're saying this is the end of your life. You're saying, how can we make whatever time is left the most comfortable? And in taking away the stigma of that, in fact, Carter, she told me, she said it was President Carter going into hospice that made it easier for her to do that. And actually, interesting statistics is that people who go into hospice actually live a little bit longer. They tend to get better care, and it's all about the social environment. People when they're isolated, they're alone in their homes. That's a huge risk factor for dementia. Social isolation. We saw it during the pandemic.
Yeah, certainly.
I want to bring in Robert Costa in Washington, D.C. Robert, as we see the boyhood home of the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, your thoughts about not only Jimmy Carter's youth, shaped by his father and his mother, clearly in the biographies, I know Doug Brinkley knows this, his father, an imposing presence in his life, one who was stern, a taskmaster, one whose love and adoration was sometimes not as forthcoming to Jimmy Carter as a boy as he would have preferred, and that was one of the drivers in his life, not only satisfying himself, but hoping to live up to the standard his father set.
And as Douglas Brinkley's great books and work on Carter show us and reveal, he, like so many of us, took qualities of both his father and his mother into his own personality. There were those steely blue eyes that could be as competitive and ruthless as anyone, but also this gentle spirit that was forged in a place like Archery, Georgia, and Plains just down the road. As a reporter for CBS, I've had the honor of going down to Archery to see this boyhood home, and we've done a feature on the boyhood home for CBS News. And whenever I talk about that trip to fellow journalists or anybody, I just tell them you got to get down to Archery. You have to go down to Plains, because even in a time in this country that feels turbulent, historic, people have their own emotional and personal views about what's happening in the country, some embracing this time of turbulence, others unhappy about it. When you go down to Plains, you see in a nonpartisan way the specialness of the United States, that for all the racial challenges that region in this country has endured and continues to deal with on many levels, the Jimmy Carter story coming out of this tiny home, when you're walking through that home, it's small, it's on a farm, there's still chickens in that boyhood home you're seeing right there, walking around the property, and Carter and his family would have to walk a long walk into Plains to get to school oftentimes. And you see that if Jimmy Carter in this century, in the last century, was able to become president of the United States with no real connections, all because of will and how this place shaped him, it does inspire you, even if you have your own concerns about the trajectory of the United States, because it wasn't that long ago that this person who came out of this boyhood home in Archery, Georgia, was able to rise. And when you go to a school down the road, which is now a wonderful museum, and I walked around Plains with Jill Stuckey, one of his closest friends, you learn that Carter was just determined not to make it out, but to take Plains with him on his journey.
That's right, and he kept it with him. You're looking at a live look right now of Plains, Georgia, as the people line the street there. We want to go down to Mark Strassman. We believe that the motorcade will be passing by him momentarily, if not already. Do we have Mark Strassman?
Yes, here's the first now. 39th President of the United States. Just past us.
And Mark, what's the mood down there? I mean, you don't hear anything. It seems very quiet, and people have the American flags, but I would imagine there's some tears there too. But as me and Major were talking before we started, this is really a moment to celebrate his life, to honor this man who did so much even after becoming